Letitia didn't mean to fall asleep. She had only wanted a few minutes, just enough for the rain to pass, for her aching calves to stop trembling after a 10-hour shift, and maybe to escape the buzz of fluorescent lights and whispered orders echoing in her head. The staff sauna was technically off limits after hours, but she hadn't planned to stay. Just sit, just breathe, just close her eyes. But the room was warm, the cedar-scented steam was soft against her skin, and exhaustion had a way of slipping in like fog under a locked door. She didn't know how long she'd been out until the air felt cooler, the sweat on her back drying against the wood. She stirred, groggy, heart-skipping. The towel wrapped around her felt unfamiliar, thicker, weightier, not the scratchy staff-issued one she'd grabbed. It smelled like something expensive and quiet. She blinked, sat up too fast, and that's when she heard it, the soft hush of the glass door sliding open. Her head turned. A tall man stood there, filling the doorway like he owned it. Because he did. He wore a charcoal robe with embroidered gold initials over his chest. AV. His hair was slightly damp, his jaw shadowed by the start of evening stubble, and his expression unreadable. Letitia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her fingers tightened the edge of the towel instinctively. The man tilted his head. "You're not staff," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. I am," she stammered, heat rushing to her face. It was raining, and the spotlights were off, and I didn't think anyone—" "You fell asleep," he cut in, still calm. "In my private sauna." Her stomach dropped. She wanted to explain, to apologize, to disappear. "I didn't mean to," she said, standing too quickly, her bare feet slipping slightly on the polished wood. He took one step forward without hesitation, steadying her with one hand at her arm. The contact was brief, his palm warm, but it lingered longer in her chest than it did on her skin. "I believe you," he said, then added more quietly, "You looked like you needed rest more than rules." She blinked up at him. His gaze wasn't cruel. It wasn't amused either. It was thoughtful. Like he saw something behind her exhaustion that even she hadn't noticed. Letitia straightened, murmured another apology, and made for the door. But as she passed him, he said more to himself than to her. "I didn't even know your name, but something in your silence made me stay." The sentence hit deeper than it should have. She didn't look back, just kept walking. And that night, lying awake on the creaky cot in the storage closet she called home, towel folded neatly in her locker, she tried to forget the way he looked at her, tried to forget how, for a second, she didn't feel like a ghost behind hotel uniforms and scrub brushes, tried to forget the strange, ridiculous ache in her chest. But she couldn't, because that was the kind of look that didn't ask for permission. It just stayed. Letitia Brooks was used to going unnoticed. In fact, she had built her life around it. Wake before dawn, blend into uniforms that didn't belong to her, and keep her head down through shifts that seemed to stretch forever. At 23, she was older than most of the interns at the exclusive Lakebourne resort, but not old enough to hide how worn her eyes looked at the end of a double shift. She didn't mind cleaning. There was something oddly peaceful about making things shine. What she minded was how no one ever looked her in the eye, as if acknowledging her presence might cost them something. But Letitia had learned long ago that invisibility was safer than attention. She had left behind a last name no one respected, a childhood house seized by the bank, and an adolescent brother who needed more than she could ever afford. After her parents were both arrested for running a fraudulent financial scheme, something Letitia hadn't even understood, at 17, she and her brother Micah had moved across the state. She picked up whatever job she could, slowly paying off the debts her name had inherited. The spa job was supposed to be temporary, just 3 months, just until the next semester, which she couldn't afford anyway. But time slipped by, and 3 months turned into a year. Now she knew every tile in that sauna, every rusting hinge behind the marble elegance, every scent the machines were programmed to release depending on guest tier. The towel from that night still haunted her thoughts, though she'd folded it back exactly the way it was. And the man, she hadn't seen him again. Not really. Once, she thought she glimpsed him in the elevator with a tablet in his hand, dressed in a tailored black shirt, his sleeves rolled just enough to show the sharp lines of his wristwatch. But he hadn't looked her way. She figured she imagined it. There was no reason for someone like him to remember someone like her. The spa manager called him Mr. Vale, a guest from the highest tier, privacy requested, long-term stay, special dietary accommodations. She had heard one of the attendants whisper that he was the tech billionaire who lost his brother. Letitia didn't ask questions. She never did. She just worked, folded, wiped, swept, and blended back into the steam. But things changed 3 days later. She was refilling eucalyptus cartridges behind the main aromatherapy room when she heard someone say her name. Quiet. Calm. She turned and saw him, Adrian Vale, in the doorway. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just said, "You forgot your badge in the sauna. I figured you'd want it back." She stepped toward him, stunned. "I thank you. I didn't even realize." He held it out between 2 fingers, then paused, his gaze steady. "You always work late?" She nodded. "The night shift pays more, and fewer people." "You like fewer people?" She hesitated. "I like silence." He studied her for a second, then gave a barely there nod. "Me too." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her holding the plastic badge, her fingers suddenly trembling. After that, it was like gravity shifted. She'd find herself bumping into him in places where no one else ever ventured. The quiet hall behind the pool lounge, the service stairwell that led to the rooftop garden no one used. Always accidental, always brief. But something about those meetings made the air feel heavier, like the silence was trying to say something neither of them dared voice. Adrian Vale wasn't like the other men Letitia had seen brushing past spa workers like they were air. He didn't fumble with his phone while speaking. He didn't wear cologne like armor. He didn't flirt. He just watched and listened. And when he looked at her, it wasn't the way men looked at women. It was the way someone might look at a map when they were truly lost. Letitia wasn't naive. She knew better than to mistake curiosity for kindness. But something in the way he always paused before leaving, like he wanted to say something and couldn't, left her breathless. Still, she told herself it didn't matter. She had bills to pay, an apartment to keep, a little brother who needed school supplies and hot meals, and a reason to believe life could be different. She couldn't afford to be seen by a man like him, and yet a part of her had already been seen, and she wasn't sure she could hide again. Letitia wasn't sure when it began, when glances turned into moments, when moments turned into silences that lingered too long to be accidental. She only knew that it started happening more often. He wasn't always in her path, but he was never far. One evening, she entered the back corridor leading to the spa's supply closet and found Adrian already there, leaning against the wall near the staff lockers, holding a cup of black coffee like he belonged in the shadows. "I heard you usually rest here during your break," he said without preamble. "I didn't think you'd remember that," she replied, trying to sound casual. "I remember things that matter," he said simply. She didn't know how to respond to that. Another night, he left a tin of salve near the edge of the sauna, unscented, medical grade. Her fingers had been cracked and red from scrubbing tile in harsh winter air. He never mentioned it, but she saw the initials printed discreetly on the label, AV. She told herself not to read into it, and yet the weight of small kindnesses began pressing against the walls she had spent years building. One afternoon, Letitia stayed late to clean the rooftop conservatory, a place few guests ever used. It overlooked the lake and had a small greenhouse with exotic plants imported for aesthetic purposes. As she swept, she looked up and found him sitting alone on the long wooden bench, not a phone in sight, just watching the water beyond the glass. He didn't speak at first. Neither did she. But when she turned to leave, he asked quietly, Do you ever feel like the world only notices you when you make noise? She blinked. I usually try not to. I used to think silence made me invisible, he said. Now I think it's the only thing that makes me real. That night, she couldn't sleep. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it with a stillness that wrapped around the words, like he wasn't used to saying them aloud. Letitia tried not to fall into the rhythm of his presence, but he was everywhere and never quite close enough. She'd hear footsteps and wonder if they were his. She'd turn corners and find his coat hanging on the back of a chair, like a phantom. And sometimes she swore he waited for her to pass by, just to ask a question he didn't need an answer to. Do you prefer the quiet because it's safe, or because it's the only place no one lies to you? What's the first thing you bought with your own money? If you could forget one thing forever, would you? Each question was a thread, and without realizing, she began to unravel. But even as this strange tether between them grew stronger, so did her fear. He was someone with rooms she would never enter, decisions she would never understand, and she was still just a girl who folded towels, who walked home in borrowed sneakers, whose dreams had been repackaged into grocery lists and overdue bills. She told herself to step back, but she didn't. The real shift came on a Thursday evening. Letitia had been cleaning the hydrotherapy room alone when the hot water pipe burst. It wasn't dangerous, just messy and fast. Water gushed across the tiles. She slipped once, caught herself, and began dragging towels to stop the spread. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt it. The temperature in the room shifted. She turned to find Adrian kneeling beside her, sleeves rolled, grabbing towels without hesitation. You don't have to. Neither do you, he said, cutting her off with the softest tone. But you do it anyway. They worked side by side in silence, soaked and barefoot. When the leak stopped, they sat back against the far wall, breathing hard. Letitia pushed wet strands of hair from her face, aware of how ridiculous she looked. But when she glanced over, Adrian was watching her not with amusement or pity, but something quieter, reverent, like she was something worth pausing for. Why are you really here? She asked. Why talk to me? He didn't pretend to misunderstand, because I wanted to know what it felt like to be near someone who doesn't want anything from me. That's not true, she whispered. I want peace from myself. I thought maybe you had some to spare. He laughed, not loud, but real. Then he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. You'd be surprised how loud silence can get when you have no one to share it with. The room fell quiet again, not empty, just full in a different way. When they finally stood, Letitia turned to him and said, You're not who I thought you were. He nodded. Neither are you. She didn't know what that meant, but it echoed in her mind for hours afterward. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. It wasn't physical, no touches, no confessions, just presence. A steadier kind of intimacy that lived in the breath between sentences, in the way he looked for her in places where no one looked, in the way he lingered when the moment didn't need him anymore. She began to expect him, not with hope, but with instinct. And that was the most dangerous part, because when you begin to expect someone, you also begin to need them. And Letitia had never needed anything she couldn't afford to lose. She just hadn't realized how close she was to losing herself already. Letitia didn't see him for 3 days. At first, she told herself it didn't matter. She had floors to scrub, uniforms to starch, and invoices to double-check before the next shipment of linen arrived. But the hours dragged longer, and she found herself listening for his voice without meaning to. She hadn't realized how much space he'd taken up in her mind quietly, like steam seeping under a locked door, until his absence made the air colder. On the 4th day, she passed by the main lobby, just as the manager was escorting a sharply dressed woman through the executive wing. The woman wore a white blazer and carried a portfolio under her arm. She didn't look like a guest. She looked like she belonged. And when Letitia turned back for one more glance, she saw her place a hand on Adrian's shoulder just before the elevator doors closed. It wasn't jealousy that hit her. It was something deeper. Recognition. The kind that hurt without explanation. That night, she wandered to the rooftop greenhouse. The moon was low, the sky overcast. She wasn't expecting to see anyone, but he was already there. Adrian stood near the edge, hands in his pockets, staring into the dark. When he turned, his eyes didn't register surprise, only something tired, older. "Did I interrupt?" she asked softly. "No," he said. "This isn't the kind of silence that can be interrupted." She took a step closer, unsure what gave her permission to be here anymore. "You've been gone." "I've been deciding whether to leave," he admitted. She blinked. "The resort?" "Everything." She paused. "Because of her?" "Because of me," he said, "and someone I never stopped being." He walked toward the bench, sat down like the weight in his shoulders finally asked for somewhere to fall. "I used to be two people," he began. "Not metaphorically. I had a twin, Elian. He was the one born with the genius, the charm, the vision. I followed, I copied, I existed in his orbit." Letitia didn't speak. She didn't move. Adrian's voice was low and even, like telling this story required him to forget it belonged to him. 5 years ago, we fought. First time in years. He wanted to walk away from the company, start something smaller, simpler. I thought it was selfish. I said things I shouldn't have. I drove too fast. It was raining. We never made it home. Her breath caught. Adrian looked straight ahead. He died on impact. I walked away with 2 cracked ribs and a body I didn't deserve. Letitia whispered, "You were the one driving." He nodded. "I became him after that, took over the company, lived like I thought he would. Efficient, brilliant, untouchable. People called me cold, and I let them, because warmth felt like betrayal. But then you—" He trailed off, then looked at her. "You made me remember I was someone else once, someone not born from guilt." She didn't know what to say. What do you say to a man who's been grieving through performance, who built an empire not from ambition but from penance? "That woman you saw, she's our family lawyer. She wants me to take a deal that will let the board buy me out quietly, disappear with dignity. Let the legacy die with him." Letitia moved to sit beside him. The bench was cold, the silence heavy. "What do you want?" she asked. He turned to her slowly. "To want something without it being about him." She didn't realize she was crying until he reached up and wiped a tear she hadn't felt fall. "You didn't owe me this story," she whispered, "but I'm glad you told me." He smiled faintly. "You were the first person I wanted to tell it to, maybe the only one." Letitia didn't say she was scared, that his pain made her feel like an intruder in a life too large, too broken for her to mend. But she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move, didn't flinch, just let her be there. When the wind picked up, she asked, "If you leave, will you tell me?" "No," he said quietly. "If I leave, it means I didn't choose anything, and I want to choose this." "Me?" she asked. "This version of me," he said, "the one who isn't a ghost wearing his brother's name." The next day, Adrian didn't leave. Instead, he had breakfast delivered to the spa staff kitchen: fruit, pastries, warm drinks, no note. But Letitia knew. That afternoon, he passed her in the hallway and didn't say a word, just brushed her fingers lightly with his, like a promise, not loud, not public, but real. And for the first time since she arrived at Lakebourne, Letitia felt like she wasn't just walking through borrowed rooms anymore. She was part of something, something not yet named, but something that mattered. Letitia never imagined a life where silence could feel so intimate. There was a quiet between her and Adrian that didn't ask for explanations, didn't fill itself with shallow words or empty gestures. It simply existed, stretching itself gently over every moment they shared, like a soft light resting on fragile skin. It had been weeks since the night she found him alone in the rooftop conservatory, confessing his truth beneath that muted sky. Since then, they had orbited each other more intentionally, never declaring what they were, but no longer pretending they were nothing. Something had shifted, not loudly, but deeply. She caught it in the way he waited for her when her shift ended, not every day, but on the ones that looked the hardest, in the way he brought her little things, warm drinks on colder nights, an old poetry book she once mentioned liking, a pair of gloves with fleece lining that she never asked for but always needed. And she saw it in his eyes, not just when they were alone, but when she passed him in corridors full of people, and he still looked only at her. Letitia felt it growing, like something wild and quiet blooming in the space between who she had been and who she might become. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. They hadn't crossed any lines yet, not truly, but lines were blurring. Every shared glance lingered longer, every touch of his hand on the small of her back, every brush of her shoulder as they walked too close. It was like a current between them, neither of them dared name. Until the night of the Lakebourne Winter Gala. The event was lavish, extravagant. It was the resort's biggest night of the year, reserved for the most powerful investors and elite clients. Letitia had no reason to be there, no right to. But 3 hours before it began, a garment bag appeared in her locker. No note. Just a dress, deep forest green, silk with a simple neckline and long sleeves that hugged her wrists. Letitia almost returned it. Almost. But something about the way it had been folded, with care and no assumption, made her heart trip. When she entered the ballroom from the service corridor, no one noticed her. Not yet. She stayed in the shadow of the stone pillars near the back, watching the glittering crowd move like waves under chandeliers. And then she saw him, Adrian, standing at the far end, in a black tailored tux, his eyes scanning the room with detached grace, until they landed on her. Then everything stopped. He crossed the ballroom without hesitation. Not fast. Not showy. Just directly. When he reached her, he didn't speak, just looked at her like the rest of the room didn't exist. Finally, he said, "You came." She nodded. "You asked." "I didn't know if you would." "I didn't either." He offered his arm. She hesitated for half a second, then took it. The music slowed into a waltz. He guided her onto the floor. She didn't know how to dance formally, not really, but he moved with such calm certainty that she followed instinctively, their steps falling into rhythm. She wasn't sure how long they moved like that, close, silent, together, but with every turn she felt something shed, the weight of fear, of pretending, of wondering. Adrian leaned down, voice low, beside her ear. "After tonight, I'm leaving the company?" Her steps faltered. "What?" "I've signed the papers. Tomorrow it becomes public." "Why?" she whispered. "Because I want a life I don't have to apologize for. And I can't have that inside a building built on someone else's name." Letitia looked up at him. Her chest ached, sharp and bright. "And me?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "You're the only thing I'm sure of." The words were simple, but in his voice, they shook something loose inside her. After the dance, he led her out of the ballroom, down the hall, through a side door that opened into the private library wing. It was quiet, candlelit, heavy with the scent of old books and fresh pine. He turned to face her. "We don't have to do anything," he said. "We can just sit, or talk, or not. I only wanted to be with you somewhere real." She stepped closer. "I'm tired of pretending I don't want this." He reached up, touched her face with both hands, slow and deliberate. "Then don't. She didn't. Their kiss was soft at first, not careful but reverent. It deepened as she wrapped her arms around his waist, as his fingers traced the curve of her spine through silk. There was no rush, no hunger, only patience. He asked with every breath if she wanted more. She answered with every shiver that she did, but they didn't undress each other completely. Not yet. Instead, she let him press his lips along her collarbone, and he let her trace the line of his shoulder with slow reverence. They lay side by side on the reading couch, fully clothed, their foreheads pressed together, hands interlaced. Their breathing slowed in unison. Letitia whispered, "This feels too good." "Then we'll take it slow," Adrian replied. "You set the pace, always." She nodded, her throat tight. No one had ever made her feel powerful in her softness. No one had ever asked her to lead with her yes, rather than chase after his. That night, Adrian didn't try to take more. He only stayed, and that was more intimate than anything else could have been. The next morning, she woke alone but not cold. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I meant it. Come find me when you're ready to be seen." Below it, a location, not the resort, not the tower, a name she didn't recognize. But her heart did, and for the first time in a long time, Letitia wasn't afraid of where this might go. She was afraid of losing it by staying silent. Letitia didn't go to the address right away. She stared at the message for nearly a full hour, the morning light crawling slowly across the cracked tile of her apartment floor. She read it again. "Come find me when you're ready to be seen." There was something dangerous in those words, not threatening, but vulnerable. She had spent her whole life trying not to be seen, first, out of fear, then out of habit. But Adrian had seen her, and that was what terrified her more than anything, because now she had something to lose. She showed up for work anyway, cleaned rooms, restocked supplies. She even smiled at the other spa attendants when they passed her in the hallway, but she didn't go to him. Not that day, not the next either. On the third day, she returned to the conservatory. He wasn't there. There was no note, no new book left for her near the bench. Just silence. She told herself that was good, that maybe it was better this way, that what they had shared that night in the library, so tender, so close, had been a beautiful mistake. But it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a before, the kind of moment people write about when they say they once had everything, even if only for a little while. By the end of the week, word had spread that Adrian Vale had formally stepped down. A quiet internal transition, no press release, no scandal, just whispers. He was gone, just like that. Letitia finished her shift and didn't speak to anyone. She went home, kicked off her shoes, curled up on the worn couch in the small living room she shared with her brother, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Micah, now 16 and sharper than she'd ever been at his age, noticed something. "You looked like someone who lost something important," he said quietly from the kitchen. "I don't know what I lost," she answered. "Then maybe you haven't really lost it," he said. "Maybe you just haven't chosen it yet." That night, Letitia didn't sleep. She took out the dress he gave her, the green silk one she wore to the gala. She touched the fabric, remembered the way his eyes softened the moment he saw her in it. She had told herself stories her whole life, that she wasn't the kind of girl someone stayed for, that she didn't deserve gentle things, that love wasn't for people who carried broken names and lived invisible lives. But Adrian had never tried to fix her. He had just chosen to see her. She didn't want to be afraid of that anymore. The next morning, she packed a small bag, left a note for her brother, and took the earliest train to the location in his message. It wasn't a luxury tower or some remote villa. It was a small property near the edge of a lakeside town, 2 hours outside the city. Quiet, humble, beautiful in its simplicity. When she knocked, no one answered. but the door was unlocked. Inside, the space was sun-drenched and half-furnished. A kettle steamed faintly in the kitchen. There was a folded blanket on the couch and a stack of books with handwritten notes in the margins. She turned a corner and found him there, barefoot in a white shirt and dark slacks, sleeves rolled, a cup of coffee in hand. He didn't look surprised. "You came," he said. She nodded. "Eventually. I was afraid you wouldn't. I was afraid too. Of me? Of what it means to want something I might actually be allowed to have." Adrian put the cup down and walked toward her, not fast, not dramatic, just steady. "You don't have to be afraid of that anymore." "And what if I still am?" "Then I'll wait," he said, "as long as it takes." She looked at him then. Really looked, the way he always had with her. "I'm not rich," she whispered. "I don't have anything to offer." "You have everything," he said, "because you never asked for anything. I don't want to be someone you ran to because you lost something." "You're not," he said. "You're someone I stayed for because I finally found something." She stepped into his arms then, not because it was a perfect moment, but because it was the most honest thing she'd ever done. He held her like he was afraid she might disappear again. She held him like she wasn't afraid anymore. Later, they sat on the small porch, watching the lake. Letitia asked, "What happens now?" Adrian smiled. "Now we build something new, something with no ghosts, no names borrowed from pain, just you and me." "And who will I be in your world?" "The reason I stopped pretending I needed one." She reached for his hand. He laced his fingers through hers. And in that moment, Letitia finally understood something that no job, no struggle, no survival instinct had ever taught her. Sometimes love isn't the thing that saves you. Sometimes it's the thing that waits quietly until you're brave enough to come out of hiding, and then it meets you, not with fanfare, but with open hands. Adrian didn't give her a new life. He gave her a choice, and this time, she chose to stay. Months later, the sauna was still there, the same curved wood benches, the same quiet hum of heat rising through stone, but it no longer held the weight of her shame or the shock of waking wrapped in a stranger's towel. It held something gentler now, a memory softened by time. Letitia had returned to Lakebourne once just for a weekend, not to work, just to walk through the halls with newer eyes, to let her fingers trail along the same railing where she used to pause during her shift breaks, heart full of daydreams too quiet to speak aloud. Adrian walked beside her, not as the man behind the company's name, but simply as hers. They didn't announce anything to anyone. They didn't need to. Sometimes, presence is enough. They had built a quiet life together in the lakeside house. She continued her art classes. He invested in smaller, sustainable ventures, things that made him feel more whole than powerful. Some mornings they made pancakes and forgot the time. Some nights they argued about grocery lists and laughed about nothing. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it belonged to them. Letitia once asked him, late one evening while watching a storm pass across the lake, "Do you think we met by accident?" Adrian smiled into the darkness. "I think we met when we were both too broken to ask for what we needed, and still brave enough to offer it anyway." She nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. Outside, the thunder faded. Inside, it was quiet, and warm, and full. Because sometimes love doesn't enter with grand gestures or poetic timing. Sometimes it slips into your life in the form of a towel left behind, a gaze held just a moment too long, a question asked softly in the middle of a hallway. And if you're lucky, if you're just brave enough to answer, it stays. Because sometimes the story doesn't start with love, it starts with a mistake, and ends with the kind of peace you didn't know your heart had been asking for all along.